I see the exploitation of the working class by global capitalism and wanting to be a part of helping to change that. And I think the labor movement is the cornerstone of that project.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
All right, we've got Patrick Korte. He is an educator in Virginia, a member of the Virginia Education Association, and VCOR, the Virginia Caucus of Rank and File Educators. Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to take it away on this interview as a former high school history teacher and a former staffer for the Alabama Education Association. Definitely excited to have Patrick on the show. So before we dig into what all is going on in Virginia, just if you don't mind, could you give us a little bit of background? Tell us your story, who you are, what you do, and how you got involved in the labor movement.
Sure. I'm a secondary history and social studies teacher here in Virginia. Relatively new to teaching, but not new to the labor movement and to community organizing. In terms of how I found myself into the labor movement, I would say a few different roads or streams that converge. One is being a worker in capitalist society and having the experience of working low-wage jobs, mostly in the service industry, though I've also worked in agriculture and a few other sectors. And, across the board, non-union labor. And I come from a family that's very supportive of unions, and I have a picture of my mom on my wall when she was out on strike as a teacher. She was a teacher as well. And so for me, that was from the 70s. For me, I always associate education and labor movement in my mind. It's deeply personal in that sense because, both my parents, my mom was a career teacher. My dad taught for some time. And, my mom being involved in her union local and getting it started and also being part of a public sector strike in the 70s. So that's sort of some of the things that come to mind in terms of how I found my way to all this stuff. There's other facets to it, I would say, which is, it's the same reason I'm interested in history and social studies, as I see a lot of the things happening in our world in terms of the exploitation of the working class by global capitalism, of, racial and transphobic and patriarchal oppression that we see in our society. And, of course, the climate crisis and wanting to be a part of helping to change that. And I think the labor movement is the cornerstone of that project.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the background. Obviously, you get it honestly. And we're two peas in a pod. A lot of your story really resonates with me. And I got to say, I believe that educators make such a difference in the way they change lives and really shape communities and shape futures. And so where the labor movement and education intersect is such an important part of our society and our economy. So I want to take it from there. If you could tell us a little bit about VCOR, Virginia Caucus of Rank and File Educators, of which you're a member.
I'd be happy to. So VCOR, well, our namesake is inspired by the Chicago Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which is a rank and file caucus inside the Chicago Teachers Union, which currently hold leadership. I'd say we're inspired by CORE and their experience, but, we're also our own project and dealing with our own situation down here in Virginia and have a different series of challenges and, our own sort of spin on things. But VCOR is a rank and file caucus. Some of your listeners may be familiar with this historically, but in case they're not, there's a tradition within the labor movement of sort of the most the most progressive segment of the union movement, getting itself organized inside the union in order to change the practice of the union organization in a more democratic, bottom-up fashion that is more militant and more aligned with like a politics of liberation, you might say. And this goes back, there's of course, many different historical examples of this and present examples. Like in the Teamsters, you have the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. That's sort of an analogous style formation. Historically, you had the rank and file group inside the New York Teachers Union, which was like a project started by like the Communist Party in the 1920s inside the teachers union there. And they organized the rank and file group to sort of transform the internal culture of their teachers union. So there's like a whole history of this stuff that goes back over 100 years. So that's sort of the tradition that we're working from and building upon. But in terms of what we encountered was, our union, when we started VCOR,
which is the Virginia Education Association, right? An affiliate of the NEA.
Yeah. So to maybe provide some background, our state union is the Virginia Education Association. So that's its parent union would be the NEA, the National Education Association. And then my local is the REA, the Richmond Education Association. So that's my local union. And when we started this project, we first, a lot of things were happening. There was the Red for Ed upsurge. There had just been the CTU strike in Chicago in 2019. And in Virginia, there was a group called Virginia Educators United, which was attempting to sort of be part of that statewide upsurge that was happening in West Virginia and Oklahoma, and to sort of build upon that. So we were in this milieu, and these were the things that were happening. And we saw that our union had become used to being a very, what we would call a business union or a service union, right? They would lobby for changes in the law. They would provide discounts on different services. But they weren't really focused on building rank and file workers' power in our school buildings on the shop floor, so to speak. Right. And that's what we were interested in doing, and providing an educational space, that could get VEA members the skills that they need to feel confident in talking with their colleagues and challenging some of the very unjust and exploitative conditions that we deal with in our school buildings.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really inspiring to see that kind of organizing happening in the South because, like you and your sisters and brothers in Virginia, I was also inspired by Chicago and the caucus of rank and file educators there, the historic strike in 2012. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the Red for Ed walkout wave that happened across the country, particularly in red states. So, I think that's such a powerful thing that we have rank and file educators in a place like Richmond and a place like Virginia coming together and organizing as some of the more, the militant minority, you might say, the folks who are committed to bringing change and not just happy to go along to get along and maintain the status quo, which I think it's easy for that to happen with established labor organizations. So now that you've told us a little bit about VCOR, one of the things I was interested in, there has been a recent change in Virginia law. And unlike many places in the South, Virginia now has the opportunity for collective bargaining at the school district level. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that and what has happened in Richmond.
Sure. I would be happy to give you the rundown on what's changed with collective bargaining and maybe even a few notes on sort of the strengths and limitations of this, right? But, in December, actually, let me back that up. On May 1st, 2021, which incidentally is International Workers' Day or May Day,
Right.
our state legislature reversed the ban or prohibition on public sector collective bargaining, but they didn't provide sweeping legalization. So, in other words, it's left up to each municipality and the appropriate governing body to decide whether to allow collective bargaining or not. So while collective bargaining, that is the union negotiation of public sector contracts, is no longer illegal, it can only be made legal if you win, for example, in our case, a vote from the school board. So our union, district by district, and this is going to create, a patchwork of union rights throughout the state. And I think that's a real drawback of this law, but it is, right, I think, a step forward nonetheless. But that just to be upfront and clear about the limitations of this. So we, started organizing for this as soon as this was announced. And the way that we did it was, we led an authorization card campaign, going building by building, and sort of connected our authorization card campaign to building the union, right? Like really using it, not just, hey, sign the card, union, yes or no, but using it as an opportunity to engage our fellow workers about what are the issues you're facing in your job, in your school building, in your work site, right? And to really bring those together and synthesize them. And then we introduced a resolution to our school board. It was like there was back and forth, and we did get a watered down resolution compared to the original one that was put forward. But that's the one the school board voted on in an 8-1 vote, which basically provides a limited bargaining for the first 3-year contract. So the first round of bargaining will be limited to 2 bargaining issues per party. And then after that first 3-year contract expires, it'll go to open bargaining on a year-to-year annual contract basis. To my knowledge, what constitutes one issue was not defined in the resolution. So that could create openings in terms of the negotiation process, but that's what it is. And so we won that resolution, and then we went forward. We were well above the 30% mark for several categories of workers, which included, workers on the teacher pay scale, safety and security, school nutritional specialists. And so those were the categories that went up for, they had the union election for. And we won by like a 99% margin. 6 workers voted against the union. So it was a resounding yes to the union. We're still organizing with custodial and transportation staff and office associates as well, like administrative and office associates. So those are the 3 categories that would be up next for a union election. But our hope, both, I would say, I can't speak for the REA. I'm just a rank and file member of the REA, but as an REA member and as a member of VCOR, certainly hope that we can build a wall-to-wall union that unites teachers, paraprofessionals, bus drivers, cafeteria staff, custodial workers, as one big union.
In the election that y'all had, what would you attribute your success to? It's a good old-fashioned union organizing. No, we didn't have a slick campaign. It was a very guerrilla campaign we didn't have a lot of staff. We just built a solid organizing core. Like was mentioned earlier, militant minority, right? We had a solid, dedicated core of organizers that were, in the parking lot talking to our colleagues about the union and about collective bargaining rights, who were in our work sites,
at lunch, in the cafeteria, on lunch duty, in getting any extra time we could get, using those opportunities to talk with our colleagues about not just why collective bargaining would be an improvement for our situation, but why we need a union and what type of union we want. And to go, to tie in where VCOR comes into play, we have a vision of a democratic, bottom-up, member-controlled union that's not afraid to fight and that's not afraid to put forward what we would call a class struggle unionist vision, meaning we see education workers as part of a broader working class struggle and not somehow separate or in some ivory tower disconnected from the struggles of warehouse workers at Amazon, Starbucks workers, right. Working the espresso machine or, working the counter, from UPS workers, whoever it might be. So that, and we really were talking about that and connected it with, there's a tale of two education unionisms here. And many of us were very inspired by some of the Latin American education workers movements, which saw themselves in a special position as educators, right? With a certain degree of trust or potential to earn trust in a community. And the question is, do you sort of position yourself outside of your school community as, some savior or crusader, right? Or do you position yourself as a part of that community, right? Part of a working class community, and really being at the service of that community. And so I think the latter is obviously what we trying to advance and, just beginning to, but that's what we were inspired by, and what we've been trying to mobilize both our colleagues and the broader community around.
Great stuff. On that note, I'm curious, what has been the reaction from the broader community, from parents, students, even the media perhaps, because we all know that teacher bashing and public sector bashing is a long media trope. And I'm curious, how has Richmond responded to this successful campaign?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like we're in an odd spot in that, our superintendent actually was not against collective bargaining. So that was like one factor in play. Our school board also did vote 8-1 in favor of collective bargaining. And the one voice of opposition is a school board member who's much more conservative and has been unafraid in voicing his views on unions, which he of classical conservative tropes about how unions will just add, more bureaucracy to our everyday lives and ruin our public education system and sort of the teacher bashing type stuff. But for the most part, I think, the bigger concern is from the state level, from the Youngkin administration, who certainly have ambitions to, I would say privatize our public sector. I don't think they hide that from anyone. And, specifically to charterize our public school system, right? And I'm not an expert on it, but Virginia, I know some of the laws on the books do make the implementation of charter schools slightly more of a challenge in Virginia. I suppose that's a good thing, but I have no doubt that there are forces that will work to try to change that. But, in terms of like students, for example, it's opened a lot of opportunities to have a conversation about like the history of, as a history teacher too, I'm especially interested in these questions about the history of labor unions, the division of society into classes, and what sort of socioeconomic division means past and present. So it created a teachable moment in our schools and communities, as educators would say.
That's fantastic. And, I'm not surprised to hear in terms of the state response, but, in listening to your story and in listening to the success that y'all have had in Richmond, my guess would be that any threats in terms of privatization, expansion of charter schools, and other attacks you may face from the state government, I would imagine y'all are in a lot better position now to fight that off and to be, you're better organized now for whatever fights are on the horizon as opposed to maybe a few years ago. Would that be fair?
I hope so. What I worry about is the massive turnover rate because,
yes,
they've grinded educators down, especially this year. And I mean, obviously, the whole stretch of the pandemic has made for a very difficult situation. And that would be obviously an understatement. But I'm seeing so many of my fellow workers who are demoralized and burned out, even as we have won this victory. And I think there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement, and we've inspired other, now we have other workers in the public sector that are getting organized. And of course, it's part of a bigger wave also in the private sector, right? Richmond had multiple Starbucks Workers United campaigns going simultaneously. Several yes votes happened in Richmond, right? We now have the SEIU campaign for city workers. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of movement. And I'm sure that, I can say that, our members in the union and in our caucus are very proud to have been part of this and to keep that struggle going. But where I worry, and we definitely are in a better place now that we have the right to negotiate our contracts. And, that's the next phase. And that's what I was going to say about the limitations of collective bargaining, right? Tale of two bargainings, just like there's a tale of two unions, right? There's unions that are run in a top-down service model, and then there's unions that are run in a democratic, bottom-up, militant fashion. And similarly, there's negotiations that can happen, behind closed doors without member participation, and then there's contract negotiations that can mobilize and rally educators, in our case, educators, but rally, workers to negotiate their contracts and to set the terms and conditions. And so obviously we hope to assist with the latter, that we want to see mass participation in this process and to use some of the infrastructure that we've built for contract negotiations. So for example, one thing we've done that I'm very proud of is organize district-wide workers' assemblies that were open to anyone, member or non-member, as a means of sort of modeling what we hope the bargaining process could be like in terms of having groups of workers, putting forward their ideas about what they would like to see their workplaces be like. Because, I agree with, Joe Burns in his recent book, Class Struggle Unionism. One of the things he says, the biggest mistake of the labor movement is giving up the fight for the shop floor. And we, in other words, workers control, right? And so that's the type of negotiation process we would like to see, is one that emphasizes workers control, which in our case, speaking for teachers, means increasing teacher autonomy, right? Not just sticking to pay, though we also need to address issues of pay and the traditional bread and butter issues, but we can't give up the terrain of control of our shop floor, which means our classrooms and our school buildings.
Right. And it's funny, you mentioned teacher autonomy, and you could turn that around, and because that's something that teachers, obviously, they want more of. They want less of the, if we wanted to slip into a sort of conservative framing here for a second, less of the bureaucrat who doesn't know anything about education telling educators how to educate, right? And there are certain times that conservatives can get at a problem without understanding why or understanding what the solution is. But this is something that teachers unions actually do fight for. They fight for teacher autonomy, and yet conservatives are not going to be backing them for this. Even the very same conservatives who are going to be on Facebook talking about how we need to, get the government bureaucrats out of our classrooms, but they're not actually going to be supporting teachers as they try to kick some of these government bureaucrats out of their classrooms.
Right.
They just want to replace government bureaucrats with corporate bureaucrats. That's what they want.
And that's
bingo.
That's the rub. Yep.
Absolutely. I had one last question for you, which would be if there are any Alabama educators who are listening who may, of course, are going to relate to some of the struggles that you experience and your colleagues, and maybe are looking at, hey, Richmond, Virginia, that's a little bit more like Alabama than, Chicago and Los Angeles. Do you have any advice for rank and file educators here in Alabama who are interested in what y'all are doing and would like to make some changes here?
Sure. So, VCOR is part of a growing national network called the United Caucuses of Rank and File Educators, and we include caucuses all around the country. West Virginia United Caucus is part of this network. The Chicago Core is part of this network. The Movement of Rank and File Educators in New York is part of this network. So there's folks all over. And I'd say get in touch with us. We'd be happy to walk y'all through what we've done and how we did this, because sometimes we look at the result and not the process behind it.
Right.
And something I've encountered, and this is maybe the history teacher in me again speaking, right? It's like history is all about, okay, here's the result, but what processes are behind it? How did we get here? Right. And people will say, oh, well, even in our state, oh, well, Richmond's different, right? Because Richmond's seemingly more amenable to this. And I think there's some truths to that, but it's also not at all straightforward. There was a lot of opposition that we faced from our fellow workers in some cases, from school board members who wanted to stall this and prevent this, from certain political and economic forces that wanted to undermine this and see this fail, for all the reasons that we know. They don't want workers to be organized and have a say in their working and living conditions. But because we got our small group together of people who had a vision, and we worked that vision out further amongst ourselves, we developed a strategy that was specific to the conditions in our school district and in our school buildings. And we began to develop a story, a narrative, again, that was specific to our situation, that resonated with our colleagues. And from there, we built it up over time. It didn't happen in a day, a week, or a month. This took us several years to get to this point. And also, this is an opportunity to just shout out all the people who came before us. Projects. There were other projects like Power, people organizing with educators in Richmond. There was Virginia Educators United. There were, other groups that came before us that led to the formation of VCOR and the struggles we had. So, my advice, though, would be find like-minded colleagues, have conversations. We started with reading some articles together about what other states, in other states, what other unions and union caucuses were doing. And then we eventually were eventually able to form our own caucus. So that's what I'd say. Connect with your colleagues, talk about the issues, read some history if you can, and get moving from there. And don't be discouraged that, it will take time to win a majority to your side. And in the South, we have a particularly difficult and long struggle ahead.
Patrick Korte, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Folks, we've been listening to Patrick Korte. He is an educator in Richmond, Virginia, a member of the Virginia Education Association and the Virginia Caucus of Rank and File Educators. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.